and welcome to the Children's and Teen Health Summit. I'm your host, Carla Atherton, founder and director of the Lotus Health Project, lotushealthproject.com, where we empower people to get healthy and stay healthy in mind, body, and spirit, and on the social, global, and environmental levels. For this session of the summit, I'm excited to be speaking with Donna Jackson Nakazawa about adverse childhood experiences and how they can cause chronic adult illnesses. Donna Jackson Nakazawa is an award-winning science journalist interested in exploring the intersection between neuroscience, immunology, and the deepest inner workings of the human heart. Her most recent book, Childhood Disrupted: How Your Biography Becomes Your Biology and How You Can Heal, examines the lifelong consequences, both emotional and physical, of adverse childhood experiences and offers readers suffering from chronic conditions a window to healing. Donna's other works include The Autoimmune Epidemic, which investigates the causes of a growing environmental health crisis, and The Last Best Cure, which chronicles a 7-year-long journey to test a variety of the mind-body therapies in order to unlock the restorative powers of the brain. She is also the author of Does Anybody Else Look Like Me?, A Parent's Guide to Raising Multicultural Children. In addition to her work as a science journalist, Donna lectures nationwide and has keynoted numerous events, including the 2012 International Congress on Autoimmunity, the Johns Hopkins Women's Health Conference, A Woman's Journey, and the To Your Health lecture series hosted by the 92nd Street Y in New York City. She has moderated panels for national health symposiums, including the American Association of Autoimmune-Related Diseases 2012 Summit, and lectured at medical schools nationwide. Donna has appeared on the Today Show, National Public Radio, and ABC News. Her work has been highlighted on the cover of Parade, as well as in Time, USA Today Weekend, Parenting, and Psychology Today. Additionally, her writing has been featured in the Washington Post, Glamour, Ladies' Home Journal, and AARP magazine. She has been a regular contributor to More and blogs for Psychology Today. She is the recipient of the 2012 AESKU Award, presented to those who have made a lifetime contribution to the field of autoimmunity, and the 2010 National Health Information Award, which strives to recognize the nation's best magazine articles in health. Donna has completed writing and residence fellowships at the Corporation of Yaddo, the MacDowell Colony, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She's received her Bachelor of Arts in English and Public Policy from Duke University and is a graduate of the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures Program. She lives with her husband, 2 children, and 3 dogs in Stevenson, Maryland. Welcome to the summit, Donna.
So happy to be here, Carla. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I am so glad to have you here. This was one heck of a chore to get our schedules to align, and I'm so glad we managed to do that.
And I am as well, and looking forward to sharing what I know.
Awesome, Donna. Okay, so let's get rolling. I just want to start off this interview by telling our audience, I would like you to tell our audience your story and how you became what I would call a health crusader. So you wrote a book called The Last Best Cure, and that's about your own personal quest, and I quote from your book title, "To awaken the healing parts of my brain and get back my body, my joy, and my life." And you also wrote a book before that called The Autoimmune Epidemic that deals more specifically with autoimmunity. So what was happening with you, Donna?
Well, great question. And for me, Carla, for the last 10 years, I've really been on a personal and professional journey through the land of immunology and neuroscience and translating the findings in these areas that affect us most deeply in our day-to-day lives, in our relationships, and in our health. So for me, this quest really began with the autoimmune epidemic. I found myself as a young parent with small children, ages 2 and 6, paralyzed with an autoimmune disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. It came on suddenly. I had other autoimmune conditions, autoimmune thyroiditis, and I got better. I worked really hard through physical therapy and diet and nutrition, and I got better. But 4 years later, I developed Guillain-Barré again, and I was paralyzed for 6 months, really unable to do anything beyond the walls of my bedroom.
Wow.
And I saw my life slipping away from me. As a science journalist, I felt that I was hearing from a lot of people that they were suffering from autoimmune conditions. And at that time, which was 2005, there was really relatively little discussion. If you said the word autoimmune, people just kind of looked at you like, what? And yet, I knew statistically that rates of autoimmune disease were rising precipitously, especially among women. So even from my hospital room, I began, looking into this, trying to see what I could do as I began to recover and could literally pick up a oversized pen, the kind that they give you in occupational therapy when your muscles aren't working, and started to keep notes about this. And I think for me, writing is a very therapeutic process. Doing science journalism and finding the studies and the research that we're not talking about as a society and bringing it out for the greater good is very empowering for me. And I really like to help people. So when that book came out, I was very much in the process of recovery, still in physical therapy. And I felt really good about the work I'd done. I'd worked closely with the National Institutes of Health. We had looked at this global rise in autoimmune disease and been able to trace it back to rising levels of chemicals in our environment, to a 21st century diet, which is full of chemicals, and lots of other things as well. But it occurred to me that I had reported less on another toxin, one we make right inside our own bodies. And that is the toxin of our chronic stress hormones. It occurred to me that here I was writing for years about greening the home and greening our environment and going green with our food, but I hadn't talked about going green in the mind. And the more I investigated another new field of research called psychoneuroimmunology, which is really the relationship between our thoughts, our brains, activity, and the intersection with our biology, the more I realized that we just weren't talking about this growing field of research, which looked at how our state of mind is pumping out either a good cocktail for our body or a negative and inflammatory cocktail. Simultaneously, I was finding that in as much as my efforts to live a normal life had paid off on my behalf, and as lucky at that point as I was to be alive, I still was missing something. I was missing joy. Illness had really become my joy thief. And I would go through long days just getting through the next moment. If I had to get the laundry basket up the stairs, I went up 2 steps, took a rest, 2 more, took a rest, death gripping the rail with one hand and carrying the basket with the other. And I one day found myself lying down at the top of the stairs at the landing, looking out over my family. My daughter just came up to the top of the steps and said, "Hey, Mom, do you know where my lacrosse jersey is?" And it wasn't at all odd to anybody that I spent a lot of the day lying on the floor. And I remember that moment so clearly. She leaned over and she rubbed her nose to mine and said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yep, good." And my son came and asked me if we could practice French verbs. And my husband wanted to know where his wallet was. And it was as if the earth reshifted on its axis. And I thought, you know, there has to be more. Yes, I have autoimmune issues. At that point, there was an autoimmune issue in my bone marrow. My fatigue level was like having the flu every day of my life. And I thought, I need to take this research on psychoneuroimmunology and I need to find out if I can change the state of my brain, if I can literally switch that pro-inflammatory cocktail to one that sends very different messages to my body and activates a different part of the nervous system. And I can get into that science as much as you want.
Sure thing.
then could I be better? Could I be more in the moment with my family? Could I come back to who I really am? And so that began my journey into the last best cure.
Okay. So I'm just, before we get into the last best cure and then childhood disrupted, which is even more of an exploration of the same issue, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so before we do that, I just want to, like, just, you did touch on the fact that, this idea that where had this kind of failing body, and, you lying on the floor wasn't at all abnormal for your family to witness, and, kind of that normalization of your illness, I suppose, maybe was, quite impactful. And how else did this whole illness affect your life as a woman and as a mother? And how did you take your health back? So I guess, two questions there, but, one could lead to the other.
Well, it was very hard to spend so much time not being able to be part of the larger life that I wanted to lead as a woman and a mother, and even as a working woman. This was really supposed to be the prime of my life. My kids were young and energetic and beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
I had a vibrant career, lots of requests to give talks and travel. And it was difficult for me to make the distance from my front door to my mailbox. So, really, the way that it impacted me, I can remember a moment standing in my bedroom and watching another mom in my neighborhood, run around after her 2-year-old and then pop him in the car and change his shoes and drive off. And I thought, for me, that's a good 20-minute exercise just to get through all that. And the loss for me was really secondary. I had lost my own father when I was a child. I was very keenly aware what it meant for a kid to have that grief of not having a parent. And I felt that for me, watching my children go through a childhood in which I was less than who I wanted to be for their sake was just the greatest motivation that I could possibly have had. So, in the long run, the benefits to me personally turned out to be remarkable to go on a healing journey and to investigate the relationship between early life trauma and later health disorders. At that moment in which I began that journey, I wanted to be able to just really enjoy this fleeting time with these beautiful kids as a family. And so that was a very, very motivating factor for me. Just, we all have those moments with our kids where you just sniff the top of their head while you're braiding their hair, and you just think this is the life channel. And I was caught on the pain channel. And it was very clear to me that to raise my children, I needed to be on the life channel because they deserved that. They deserved to have a mom who was here with them in the present, being with them where they were, instead of the mom I was, which was really, I was caught in a chronic cycle of worry over my next doctor's visit, what my next symptom would mean, what that blood test meant, how I was going to manage the next 2 hours. I didn't want to be that person for them.
So would you say, do you do that now, Donna? Like, do you still get to that space where you're kind of worried about relapse, or where you're still doing a lot of doctor's visits and a lot of, checking in or testing and all that stuff?
No, I don't. I really have come out from the revolving door world of 7 fantastic specialists, what I call the ologists, to working with my primary care doctor and continuing all the different modalities that have made my life very, very different. Now, one little caveat there, from the last best cure, I spent a year doing meditation, mindfulness-based stress reduction, yoga, laughter yoga, time in nature. acupuncture, and a number of other scientifically supported brain-body practices that have been shown to downshift the inflammatory response. And what I mean by that is we're saying that our nervous system really functions on two different operating systems. They're both under the auspices of our autonomic nervous system, but our sympathetic nervous system, and to make it easier for our listeners, I call that the stress now system, sympathetic nervous system, SNS. And we also have our parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS. I call that the per now system. So in modern life, we run 24/7. Well, I can't say that because not when we're sleeping, right? But we run pretty much on the stress now system. We're caught up in overdrive. We have all these moments, an unexpected bill comes in the mail, somebody swerves in front of us on the highway, we have an argument with our spouse or an altercation with our teenager, or our best friend says something. And, we're caught in this super stressful, wow, what did that mean? I said the wrong thing. Well, what about that? And on top of it, when you have a chronic illness and the doctor leaves a message for you, or your white blood cell count is falling low again, you have those tapes going. On top of which, for many of us, and we'll get into this a little more deeply, because especially for those of us for whom this chronic stress was set on high in childhood, there's that chronic voice of self-criticism. We're not on our own side. That voice that's like, well, of course you fell down the steps, get up and get up. Of course you're late. You don't even deserve to do this because, you were late. You were running late. Of course, you always screw up. I don't know if your listeners can relate to that voice, but many of us have that voice, especially when we've been suffering from chronic illness. So that voice is all part of the stress now system. And biologically, we're supposed to run all the way through a stress cycle. So we're in that first half of the stress cycle, which is, how am I going to pay this bill? My boss said something to me in a meeting. What does it mean? I'm running late. There's a lot of traffic. I didn't like what my husband said on the phone. I'm a screw up. I'm messing up. I can't do this. What an idiot I am. But in nature, we're supposed to go through the second half of the stress cycle, which is to come out of that sense of fight or flight or freeze and go into a sense of homeostasis. And in nature, animals do that by either fighting or fleeing, or sometimes you'll see animals just quivering to release that stress response. Well, we don't do it in modern life. We don't ever get through the second half. There is no release. So we're caught on the stress now system, that part of our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, in a sort of 24/7 role for all of our waking hours. We are supposed to be existing on the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, the per now system. And that's that sense of homeostasis. It's the sense that we're inside our body, we're breathing, we're aware of who we are, we're in the moment. If we're sitting with our teenager, we're actually being with them rather than thinking and ruminating about other things. And then if something stressful really happens, burglars knock on the door, then we go into a stress spike response and we call the police. Turns out it wasn't burglars, it was the UPS man, and we go back into a sense of release and back into the per now system. So we're kind of living evolutionarily in the wrong space. And so for me as a mom and as a science journalist, really understanding that living with the parasympathetic nervous system activated actually leads to lesser inflammation, which in my case could mean less of an autoimmune action in my bone marrow, and perhaps, I hoped, even some recovery of my muscles and neurological system. Well, it seemed to me that this was a journey I really needed to take.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into that. The newer book, The Childhood Disrupted, How Your Biography Becomes Your Biology and How You Can Heal. So What are adverse childhood experiences, ACEs as you call them?
So we call them ACEs, and adverse childhood experiences. The research into this began in 1998. And let me just tell you a little bit about that, and then I'll explain what these categories are.
Okay.
So, two physicians decided to compare the childhood experiences of 17,000 middle class Americans who were already in the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system and take those childhood experiences and compare them to their adult health records. And the results were really shocking. It turned out that 64% of people had suffered from some form of early emotional trauma, and that the number of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences the patient had faced before age 18, that predicted how much medical care they would need in adulthood. So some of the stats are staggering. People with an ACE score of 4 were twice as likely to be diagnosed with cancer or depression as those with none. And women with 3 adverse childhood experiences had a 60% greater risk of being hospitalized with an autoimmune disease as an adult. Now, that, of course, right, with my history, when I read that statistic in the research, and there are now 1,500 studies looking at this relationship between early emotional trauma and later adult health disorders, and with my understanding as a science journalist as to how the brain affects the body, I was suddenly brimming with questions. What does this mean for the developing brain? Why does this relationship exist? Why are some affected more than others? Why are women affected more than men? So other things came up in the research, other dramatic links between early adverse life experiences and heart disease, a whole range of chronic illnesses that are very hard to control for adults. And one of the statistics that also really stood out to me was that an ACE score of 6 shortened an individual's lifespan by 20 years. So once again, I felt, as I did with the autoimmune epidemic, which no one was looking at, as I did with the last best cure, noting that no one was looking at this relationship between health improvement and psychoneuroimmunology. I felt that we as a society, and I as a journalist, I had talked about a lot of things. I've talked about all the multifactorial agents that create illness in the body, from chemicals to diet to adult stressors, life stressors, and genetics, of course, and environmental, infections and viruses. All of these things combine. If we think of the immune system a little bit like a barrel, and eventually that barrel fills and there's that last drop and we spill over into disease. Well, the immune system is a little bit like that. Of course, genetics preload the barrel. Any chemicals or infections or viruses we've been exposed to, those also tax the immune system. The toxic reaction that our brain produces when we're caught constantly on the first half of the stress cycle and are producing this inflammatory cocktail of hormones and chemicals in our own brain, that loads the barrel. But it turned out that another enormous factor was whether or not we started life with a large quotient of stress, and whether that stress had created very clear biological changes in the way that we would react to stress for the rest of our lives, which would in turn increase this psychoneuroimmunological response throughout the lifespan, causing more inflammation and disease.
It's almost like, like that idea that, that pathway is burnt into your brain at that point. And so it's really difficult to kind of come out of that without effort.
Well, right. And so let me do 2 things. Tell you what these categories of adversity are, because I'm sure many listeners are saying, well, what are we talking about here? And then why, on a biophysical level, over 1,500 studies now show that these types of adversity and some others that we're coming to discover are related to greater likelihood of illness in adulthood. So let's do those two things.
Yep.
So first of all, adverse childhood experiences include 10 basic categories. Being chronically humiliated by a parent or afraid of them.
Mm-hmm.
Ever being pushed, grabbed, slapped, or thrown by a parent or hit, of course. So physical abuse, but also, being physically pushed around.
Mm-hmm.
Being touched sexually by anybody in your home who was 5 years older than you. And feeling emotionally neglected. In other words, your family didn't look out for each other. They didn't feel close to each other. So that kind of emotional trauma of feeling that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special. Being physically neglected to the extent that you had nothing to eat or not enough to eat, that you had to wear old or dirty clothes, or feeling that no one would take care of you if you were ill or take you to the doctor or bandage your knee. It also included some very common types of household situations, such as having a biological parent lost through divorce or separation or death, as in my case, having lost a dad when I was a child. It included witnessing your mom being mistreated, pushed or kicked or slapped or threatened by another person in the household. And we know now, by the way, that this can include seeing any member of the household abused, including a sibling or a dad. Living with an alcoholic parent. How many people can relate to that? A parent who had a problem with drinking or any other kind of addiction. Living with a parent or family member who suffered from depression or any other type of mental illness, also very common. Having a household member who attempted suicide. And the last category that researchers have looked at in this particular body of research is having had a household member who was in prison, who went to prison or was incarcerated. We now see research which is also linked to bullying, being hazed in school or by friends. And we're looking also at some of the relationships between the chronic stressors that kids face today in an over stressful academic environment. And we know, of course, that poverty and living with community violence can also be considered as ACEs. So this research is extending forward from the original survey. So to do the second thing and talk a little bit about, well, okay, why would this kind of chronic childhood adversity change us in ways that would make us so much more likely to be diagnosed with cancer, depression, autoimmune disease, heart disease? What's going on here? So it turns out that this kind of chronic, unpredictable stress in which a child does not know in any of these situations what is going to happen next, causes the brain to go on high alert. So let me just give you an image for that.
Okay.
When we go back to what we talked about, where, we're supposed to function on the first half of the stress cycle in fight, flight, or freeze, and then come out of it and come back to homeostasis. So let's talk about if we met a bear in the woods, right? Yep. We're camping with our family. There's bear. We're going to be in fight or flight, freeze. We're going to really, everything in our body is going to go into a fight or flight state. We're going to be flooded with these neurochemicals. And in this case, this is really good for us because it tells us, run to the tent and zip it up, or, call the forest ranger. Every bit of blood is going to rush away from our stomach and into our limbs. That's why we get that butterfly effect, because literally blood and oxygen are racing away from the stomach. There's going to be a hair that goes up on the back of our neck. That's our body telling us we need to be we have to have a lot of proprioceptive awareness and see what's coming from all directions. So those things happen. Great. The bear looks at you, turns around, walks away.
Right.
Whew, all right. You know what? You feel a lot better. Stress spike goes down. But what if that bear is in your own living room? What if that bear is coming into your bedroom at night? What if that bear is in the kitchen every time you go in to get a drink of water. And you just don't know, is the bear going to come towards you and say or do something that's profoundly hurtful? Or is the bear going to walk away and shrug? Or is the bear going to be loving? That creates a number of physical changes within a child's developing body. And these are complex scientific changes, but I'm going to try to simplify them as much as I can and break them down so that they're really understandable. So one of those changes is that state where a child has to stay in high alert and constantly think what's coming next. They may be doing this unconsciously, by the way. They're so accustomed to kind of second guessing, hey, how will mom be today? Or what will dad be like when he comes in from work? Or, if I try on this dress, is my mom going to tell me, I look fat? Or, am I going to be told I was stupid for getting a C on the algebra test? Kids aren't necessarily aware of this chronic state of hypervigilance. Mm-hmm. But even in a state where they're not conscious of it, and they might even say, no, my home life is great, everything's great, it's hunky-dory, their body and brain become flooded with these inflammatory stress factors, which we talked about. Mm-hmm. And those begin to alter genetic function in a way that researchers can see in the lab literally resets the stress response to high for life. So let me give you an image for that. We think of genes as, I got these genes, you got those genes, we're going to be who we're going to be based on our genes. And yet we know through the growing study of what's known as epigenetics, that is not the case. What happens is that our genes are kind of like flowers, and these flowers open up like the petals, to the morning sun when we're in a very healthy environment. But when there are stressors in the environment or environmental hits, which again could be from exposures, viruses, infections, whatever those exposures are, which include the inflammatory hormones we create in our own body, some of those petals may not open. And there are genes, many genes, that oversee the stress response. So they help our brain to react to a stressor, turn on that hose of inflammatory chemicals, that cocktail, do good, and then, really important, turn it off. And what researchers have found is that in kids who have experienced these adverse childhood experiences, there is a shift in the way those flower petals of their genes open. They're not opening. Those genes are altered in their function so that stress response is set on high for life. It's as if the garden hose is on and the dial to turn it back is not working. Mm-hmm. In fact, researchers at Yale and the University of Wisconsin in 2 separate recent studies have found that children who face this kind of toxic childhood stress demonstrate changes across the entire genome, not only in the genes that oversee the stress response, but in the genes that are implicated in the likelihood, in one's personal likelihood of developing all of these adult diseases that we've talked about. So I really felt that this research, has just not been reported, and we need to be talking about it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So you have a tool in your book, and it's to assess your ACE score. And so, why is it important to acknowledge what happened to you as a child and to actually, figure out what your score is? And, what does this insight do to improve your health as an adult?
Well, what a great question. So I would never write a book if I didn't have as much science for how we can heal as I do for what makes us ill. Yeah. I'm very interested in how illness happens, but I'm even more interested in how extraordinary healing happens. Mm-hmm. So first, many, many people, when they first come across this research, and it may be happening to some of your listeners now, there is this sense of aha. Mm-hmm. They feel as if their entire lives they've been swimming against a kind of invisible tide and struggling a little too hard for a little too long with chronic emotional issues, chronic physical health conditions that just won't abate. And they hear this research and it makes sense to them inside. It feels right that, hey, I think I might have been one of those kids who was caught up in this heightened stress response before I really had any way of managing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm still caught in this heightened stress response. And wow, this heightened stress response is really another way of saying inflammation. And inflammation leads to mental health struggles, depression, and a range of physical disorders. So knowing that is in no way to say, oh my God, this is just stress. In any way.
Right.
No one is saying this is just stress. We're saying this is physical. We are saying that the line between what is emotional and what is physical is blurred, and we need to stop thinking as if medicine and health exist in separate silos where what we think and how we perceive our world and the stress we're under is, one silo to be treated in the mental health community, and how we feel and whether or not we're having neuropathy and what our thyroid numbers are is in a physical silo. What we are saying is that these are one. And for many people, that revelation is at first a little scary after that big aha moment. But what I would say is that it offers us a new layer of healing exploration in addition to everything that we may be doing for our health. And no one is saying, we don't still require our medications and the best that Western medicine has to offer, but it provides the opportunity for a real healing plan that takes this inflammatory stress response that was set in place by chronic childhood adversity into account and looks at the brain-based, scientifically supported ways that now exist to come back to who it is we hope to be and who we might have been if we hadn't had these early experiences that changed the architecture of our body and our brain.
Wow. Okay, Donna, that's really powerful. So first, I want to just ask you about stress and children first, and then I want to get into how we fix this. So why is stress more damaging to children in particular?
So again, when the body and brain are developing, it's when these genes are really coming into their full expression or not. It's when these flower petals on our genes, to use that image again, either flower or don't. And so what happens to a child is that when that genetic shift goes into place, we are kind of setting a little bit of neural cement, which is not to say we can't jackhammer that neural cement and change it later in life, because we can. Half of my book is devoted to the ways that we can do that. But what also happens is that for kids, chronic, unpredictable, toxic stressors, and let's just take 1 minute to say there is a difference between these ACEs we've discussed and what we call normative stress, right?
Yeah.
So normative stress is your kid keeps missing the bus, and you know what? They have to take the consequences for missing the bus. And you don't just keep driving them in your pajamas if they keep missing the bus. They have to figure it out. And maybe they miss a test at school and they get a C, and they have to learn, wow, I can handle this kind of stress. And in fact, I can do more than handle it. I can actually learn a little bit of failure and learn resilience by figuring out what to do about it. They break the rules. They come home after curfew. Okay, there are consequences for that. And they include, you're going to be doing the dishes every night this week. We've talked about this. Here are the boundaries. That's normative stress. Those are normative stressors. Maybe, a grandparent dies and a child is super sad for a long time, as they would be. Those are normative stressors, and we can support our children through those, but we can't fix everything for them. When we talk about toxic stress, those are not normative stressors. And where normative stress makes our kids a little bit stronger, it gives them grit, it gives them resilience. toxic stress does not give our kids grit. It hurts their bodies and brains. It reduces their well-being for life. It doesn't make them stronger. It does not make them tougher. It breaks down the bodily systems that we need them to have to keep them physically and emotionally strong as they grow and develop. So I just really want to make that point. And so the other ways in which this kind of early toxic stress damages children is that it literally eats away. Okay, so here's the thing. So neuronal pruning. So our brain has lots of different types of cells in it, but one are known as neurons. Okay, so those are what help us make all those synaptic connections. And kids are born with more than what they need. So as kids grow and develop, they don't need all the neurons that they have. And something called microglia begin pruning them off. Microglia are what we think of as the trash men in the brain. So a kid gets older and your daughter is interested in soccer and poetry, but she's not very interested in some other, she's not interested in surfing. So any different areas that children develop, the neurons continue to make deeper and deeper connections and pathways in those areas, but some of this overabundance of neurons has to go, right? So the microglia start to take out different neurons that aren't being used or needed. That is so super simplified, but let's just say that's how it works. Now, what happens is that chronic, unpredictable, toxic stress, or what I call cuts, I like acronyms. So cuts in childhood, early cuts. The microglia don't like chronic, unpredictable, toxic stress. So they become a little bit like Pac-Man, and they go around and they do something that's pretty harmful. They don't just eat away at the neurons that are needing to be pruned away. They eat away at neurons that kids need.
Wow.
So they actually take away these very important connections. They prune away at connections between different areas of the brain, and the ones that probably we could focus on best to simplify this is the amygdala, the alert center of the brain, the hippocampus, which is sort of like our experience simulator. We kind of think of it like NASA, how astronauts go into a simulator for flying a spaceship. So not spaceship, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that simulator is where we go and we go, hey, what are all my memories here? What happened last time I was at a party and somebody said something like this? How do I feel when someone makes a cutting comment? And it relies on our past memories and experiences. And it also tells us kind of like, well, what's true? What's real? What should I react to? What shouldn't I react to? And then the prefrontal cortex, which comes in and says, okay, so here's what I'll do next. So what happens when those connections between the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex are less robust than they need to be? Those neural connections are a little bit offline. They're a little bit fragmented.
Yeah.
Is that those signals get a little bit misread. So we have a kid who's at a party and somebody says something, it's a little bit cutting. The amygdala, which is the alert center, the sort of police siren goes into high alert. It's flashing, danger, goes into the hippocampus. The hippocampus says, wow, this is just like my whole life. I've just been criticized, because maybe they've endured a lot of chronic humiliation at home. Goes into the prefrontal cortex. It says, we need to get away from this person and tell them, go to hell or stomp off.
Right.
So you can see how our reactivity to life is very much connected to these neural connections going between many different areas of the brain. But these are the three that are easiest to sort of explain. And so what happens is that researchers can see that in kids who faced a lot of chronic unpredictable stress as children, those microglia have over-pruned. The hippocampus is actually smaller, and the overall brain matter in children who have faced adverse childhood experiences, brain volume is smaller. So these are pretty staggering findings. And there are actual differences in what happens in the brains of boys and girls. Girls show more offline, more neural damage. I don't like the word damage, but more loss of neural connections in areas that relate to how fearful we will be to the world around us. So leading really to what you might think of as these greater rates of anxiety and depression that women grow up with. So boys show other areas of neural connections that are going offline, which lead to more behavioral issues, more ADHD. So this research is really bringing into focus, why is it that women are so much more likely to grow up with depression and anxiety disorders? Why are boys so much more likely to have ADHD? One so important caveat, these are not the only factors that lead to later health conditions or mood disorders or behavioral issues. You can have a perfect childhood and grow up and have depression or ADHD or autoimmune disease. No one is saying that A is the only cause of B. Genetics and other environmental factors, all the things in the barrel that we talked about, those play an equal role. So I just want to make that clear.
I'm so glad you made that point, Donna.
Yeah. And it's really important because I know a lot of people who had perfect childhoods and their parents, that just things were great and they still grow up and they have, for genetic reasons, depression or autoimmune disease, or kids who experience ADHD, and they've just got the most fantastic parents on the planet. So there are other factors going on in our environment. Genetics, foods, chemicals, infections. And these are just as important as one's history of early adversity. It's really about the perfect storm.
Yes. Okay, so Donna, I would really like you to share with our participants here, how do you, first, I have a question about the adults listening who may have had these sorts of adverse things happen to them, and how do we fix them? And then also the second question would be about parenting, our kids, and but anyway, so I'm going to ask you that first one first. So for the adults listening, how do we fix this? Or even with their kids that are kind of young and we think, well, they've been through a lot and, their mom died last year or something like that. Like how do we fix the damage that's caused by ACEs?
So there are incredible new studies coming out about ways that we can make sure our biology is not destiny. Of course, what happened in our childhood, that lasts with us for a lifetime, but the results of it do not have to. We can absolutely reboot our brains. And even if we've been set on a high reactive mode for decades or even a lifetime, we can still dial that down so that we are shifting away from that overreactive inflammatory response. I think the way that I like to think of it is that children who experienced ACEs, they became adults who have less resilience through no fault of their own. It is no adult's fault that when they were children, the people who were supposed to protect them and keep them safe didn't do their job. But we can become neurobiologically resilient, and we can turn epigenetics that were bad or negative or cause this neural damage into good epigenetics. And we can begin a journey to rescue ourselves. I call it the neurobiology of awakening.
Wow.
And I will tell you before I go into a couple of these tips that I have seen, and I followed in my book 13 individuals who went through a lot of early adversity, some of them more than others, and followed them through their journeys of recovery. And I can tell you that these individuals, they are better for their experience. They have a layer of resilience. They have come to a place of growth. And I would even say transformation that makes them more aware, more engaged, more compassionate, wiser, and better contributors to the world at large. So what does this journey look like? Well, it's different for every person, but here are some of the things we know from the science are really working. The first most important thing is to just take this ACE questionnaire and look at the results and help to normalize for yourself your own experience. When we talk about what happened, it removes the power that secrecy so often has.
Yeah.
Often, when we've grown up with adverse childhood experiences, they were secrets. In other words, no one ever spoke about them. And therefore, we have internalized a sense of shame or that something was wrong with us, that we did something wrong. And coming to this revelation can be very healing in and of itself. I would suggest that listeners go one step further and share their findings about their own ACE score with a healthcare professional, somebody they trust, a doctor, a physician, a therapist, so that they can bring this conversation out into their healthcare journey.
Okay.
Another thing that's really important for people and has been very powerful for many of the individuals I followed is writing to heal. Just spending 20 minutes a day writing down your deepest emotions and thoughts about what happened. It may be something that you later want to share with a therapist, a sister, a brother, if you have grown children, or even your parents, if that's a safe thing to do. But research tells us that when we do this, when we tie our past experiences into our life right now and how we feel right now, and we just do this 20 minutes a day and write our story, that patients have fewer doctor's visits and they show changes in their immune function. So this is a pretty simple thing that we can all do, and we don't need to hire anyone to help us do it.
Yeah.
The area that's been most studied is mindfulness-based stress reduction and meditation. And there is a growing body of research that tells us that people who practice mindfulness-based stress reduction, which I myself am a great advocate of, it saves me about 1,000 times a day, show an increase in gray matter in the same parts of the brain that have gone offline or been damaged or denuded by adverse childhood experiences. So we can literally see a repopulation of neurons in these connections in the brain. And more recent research has shown shifts in those same genes that went through a bad epigenetic change can shift back in a positive way that helps us to regulate our psychological and physiological stress response. So this is pretty powerful. Researchers have found recently that even those who are suffering from PTSD due to childhood sexual abuse, who took part in mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, they showed changes in their epigenetic expression even 2 years after taking a meditation course. I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah. More powerful than anything I've ever seen.
Well, when you think about it this way, Carla, there are lots of medications that will dampen down the sympathetic nervous system, the stress now system. But we don't have a single medication known to man that will boost the per-now system or the parasympathetic nervous system. We just have these tools that have been around for thousands of years, which include meditation, mindfulness, working with our breath exercises, yoga, and different body exercises to get into the body, somatic release, somatic exercises, trauma release exercises, which work with releasing the psoas muscles in the body, which are often really tense and have been tense for a long time in kids who got stuck in fight or flight. So there are lots of breath, brain, body approaches, and these are just stacking up in the research as being incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how we undo it, is to reduce the stress.
And working with the body and the brain to do that, sometimes we need to reach out to a professional. You know, sometimes the long-lasting effects of childhood trauma, they're just too great to tackle on our own. And meditation and yoga are not always enough. We have to look at those unresolved issues in a therapeutic relationship. And get a little backup as we unpack the past.
Okay.
So working with a skilled therapist can be a really wonderful thing to do. Research is coming in showing that patients who undergo therapy also are showing changes in the integrity of their genome, even a year after sessions have stopped. So, of course, you need to find the right therapist. It needs to be a therapist who's giving you unconditional acceptance so that experiencing that unconditional acceptance can help to modify those circuits in the brain that told us we had to stay in fight or flight and that we couldn't trust anyone. And a therapeutic relationship can help us to grow new, healthier neural connections.
Yeah.
Two specific types of therapy have been shown to also be pretty powerful. One is called EMDR therapy, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The World Health Organization just announced recently that this is one of only 2 forms of psychotherapy that they are allowing for children and adults in natural disaster settings. And the way that this pretty potent form of psychotherapy works is that individuals are able to remember difficult experiences safely, and then they relate those memories in ways that expose them to that past trauma, but they're in a safe situation with their therapist. So they work through those difficult experiences safely. And as they do, they are asked to shift their eye gaze back and forth. This sounds a little wild, but they follow like a pattern of lights or a wand that moves from right to left and right to left. And that action actually simulates REM sleep. So REM sleep allows the brain to do a kind of brainwash and kind of clean out in a healthy way, as opposed to those stressed microglia eating the wrong neurons. REM sleep allows this great brainwash. It's why we feel better in the morning, even when we went to bed really stressed out, right? And so EMDR therapy, when I started writing the book, I just didn't know if I believed in that. But I actually went through some sessions myself. I really delved into the research, and I'm pretty impressed. And in fact, research is now showing that EMDR therapy increases the volume of the hippocampus.
Wow. Okay, so we're running out of time here. I know you've got to run. So if we could just leave our parents and caregivers with one last little bit of insight from you, Donna, about how we can be the best parents we can be, even if we may have not been well parented ourselves.
That's such a great question. And it's so important to me that we get to this because, of course, there is nothing that concerns us as parents except, more than the consequences of every act or thought.
Oh, it's hard.
It's hard. It's like, oh my God, I said or did this.
Yep.
So I just want to reassure parents that, the brain has a remarkable capacity to make new neurons and synaptic connections. And there is no such thing as being a perfect parent. There is no such thing as being a parent who does everything so wisely that our kid's brain creates pristine neurobiological interconnections. However, that said, there are things we can do well that help our kids develop neurobiological resilience and that we can do to nurture them and prevent even chronic unpredictable stressors from taking a long-term toll. So some of the most important ones that I look at in childhood disrupted, let's really start with the most important, and that is to manage your own stuff, right?
Yes.
So a lot of times adversity is inherited from preceding generations, and there's a larger narrative that comes before our own story. We may not have gotten the parenting that we needed, and therefore we still have a few emotional shackles in how we react to our kids that are based on how we were treated as children.
Yeah.
And that's normal, and it makes sense. So the most important thing we can do is manage our own unresolved issues and keep them from spilling over into our kids' lives. So that means that everything we just talked about helping ourselves is the very most important thing that we can do for our kids. Because look, good parents make good kids.
Yeah.
And managing your own stuff is going to be the thing that makes you less reactive. And it's probably the single most important thing you can do to ameliorate or correct any mistakes you've ever made. So let me talk about how that works. We've all had moments where we're irritated or upset with our kids, and we feel like we said or did the wrong thing. We lose our temper. If you're talking to a teenager and they're on their computer and you've asked them 5 times to take out the trash, and the trash man comes and goes and the trash isn't taken out and it's going to be stinking in the house for another week, that can be very irritating, right? We can find ourselves saying something we really don't mean to say. And it may also be it's just the straw that breaks the camel's back. We may have a chronic illness that we're dealing with. We may have bills that we're struggling to pay. Our parent could be in the hospital. We had a bad day at work, and we just don't have the neurobiological resilience to say, deep breath in the moment. What are the consequences for this? We just say, you never do what you say. You always let me down. You're just like your father or whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the most important thing we can do is make a repair right away. We're all going to slip up from time to time because we're frustrated or overwhelmed. It's how we handle ourselves afterwards that really counts. So just stopping and saying, hey, I really raised my voice there and I must have scared you. I wish I hadn't done that, and I'm sorry. Or, hey, this is what's happening for me. I just came in the door. I lost the bid on a contract. I have a lot on my mind. I expected you to help out. This is why I reacted, and I'm sorry. And what I said and did was wrong. Guess what happens? All those alert centers in the brain that light up for kids that tell them that they can't trust adults. Whew. Stress pass, they go back into a sense of homeostasis. The amygdala stops lighting up. An apology is the most important first thing we can do. But Carla, that doesn't mean we don't also impose limits, right?
Yeah.
Our kids need to know they can't throw things when they're angry. They can't come home late. They can't talk to us in a way that's disrespectful. They can't scream at us. So we also have to step in and put those limits. And after we apologize, if an apology is necessary, just acknowledge that there are also rules. Hey, this must be upsetting. It's really hard to not get your own way and have to do chores when you don't want to. But this is our rule. You have to do these chores, or you can't stay out past your curfew. And here are the consequences for that. And they include X and Y. So we're able to send 2 messages at the same time. We admit that we regret the way we responded, but we still stand our ground. We still parent. And this is an important point because a lot of times for parents who have suffered ACEs, we go into this mode where we say or do something we regret, and we immediately feel this overwhelming sense of shame that we are somehow bad. And it goes into this kind of spin-off of, well, I'm bad, my kid's bad, I'm bad. And we get caught in this cycle of feeling guilty about our response, feeling angry at our child. And guess what? We're either going to overreact in that moment and say more stuff we don't mean, or we're going to underreact and freeze and say nothing and shut down. And what happens to a child in that moment is critical to know. And that is that kids who see that their parent is either overreacting or underreacting, they go into a freeze state because your parent is the person you're supposed to be able to run to when you're frightened. But if your parent has frightened you, you can't run to them and away from them at the same time, right? Like that's biologically impossible. So kids go into a freeze state. Hey, I want to run to mom or dad because they're just screaming at me and they're the person who makes me safe. I also want to run away from them because they're scaring me and I'm feeling really bad and ashamed about what I did. But they can't do both at the same time. So they're frozen. Their brain is frozen. They cannot biologically take two counteractions simultaneously. So that means that we really have to jump in, make the apology, and then we have to make clear what the boundaries are. I would throw in really quickly that research is showing us that we also have to, in the same way that we acknowledge what's negative or what's hard for them and really validate problems that they're facing, we also have to really emphasize the good. So parenting is this wild balance of acknowledging when our kids are suffering and validating their experience. It's saying, hey, that has to be really hard. You didn't get the grade you wanted on that test. This sounds like a problem. I know you can handle it. What are your options?
Yeah.
But it also means that in addition to just trying to stay alert to the things that might be hard or hurt them.
Mhm.
And when we have a history of ACEs, our brain is also still, as an adult and a parent, on hyper alert for the things that might hurt our child or that they might be feeling bad about.
Mhm.
We, with a history of ACEs, have to do even more work to emphasize the good.
Yeah.
Take in the positive experiences and make memories of those pleasant experiences, help highlight the positives in our everyday experience. So, you might be sitting with your child by a pond and there's a fish and the wind is blowing and the trees are beautiful. And you might say, hey, isn't it so nice that we can be here together?
Mm-hmm.
You might be eating a piece of chocolate together and just say, doesn't this chocolate taste delicious? Isn't this a nice moment? Or I'm really enjoying spending this afternoon with you. We're really having fun, aren't we? Just so that the not so good moments are kind of counterbalanced by these new positive neural networks that they can draw on later in life as wells of good feeling. And we know from the research, this also really enhances resilience.
Wonderful.
And wow, I really talked a lot.
I so appreciate it. I know that you had to go all this time and you went the extra mile to make sure that all our listeners got all the goods and everything you wanted to share with them. So I really appreciate that, Donna, that you went the extra mile there.
Well, I just don't want to leave anybody feeling that there is a sense of hopelessness or that their biology is their destiny. We all really have the capacity within ourselves to create better health and to create better health for our children. So this science is so important to me.
Yep.
I hope it's useful for your listeners. I hope they'll pick up the newest book, Childhood Disrupted, because honestly, I put everything I know in that book.
Awesome. I've got it. Okay, so Donna, so she's written 3 books. Well, more than that, but the 3 that we're talking about here today were The Autoimmune Epidemic, The Cure,
The Last
Best Cure, and Childhood Disrupted. So, I mean, she says pick up the last one. Pick up all of them. They're phenomenal books. And also, Donna, is there anything else you want to share? How to get a hold of you? What's your website again?
Yeah, sure. DonnaJacksonNakazawa.com, and Nakazawa is hard to spell. N-A-K is in kangaroo, A, Z is in zebra, A, W is in water, A.com.
Yep.
I would say that our biggest conversation is going on my public Facebook page, which is Donna Jackson Nakazawa author.
Okay.
I'm also on Twitter, Donna Jack Knock. And we have a community going on acesconnection.com. So the best way, if you were going to just choose one, would probably be checking out the discussion going on Facebook, because I'm really good about meeting my readers there and answering their questions and putting new studies and new articles I'm doing up there.
Okay. Well, I'll be there, Donna, for sure. Count me in.
Love it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Donna. And I really appreciate you being part of the 2nd Biannual Children's and Teen Health Summit. And you have yourself a wonderful afternoon.
And you as well, Carla. Thanks for including me. And here's to hoping all your readers and listeners have a great healing experience.